10 years ago, I released the very first comic for the Undertale AU, Inverted Fate. It was a simple, flat-colored comic setting up the basic premise. Asriel won at the end of Undertale's pacifist ending, but something went wrong. He was back in the ruins, Flowey once more, when he'd had power in the palm of his hand. Furious, he blamed Kara, but little did he realize, the world and its history had changed. Inverted Fate would continue as a sprite comic with occasional comic pages, then later replace those comic pages with cutscene panels. What started largely as a solo endeavor gradually evolved as more artists, musicians, animators, and even programmers lent their talents and creativity to the project. Now, a decade later, Inverted Fate's ending draws near, and though there are still a few chapters remaining, I thought now was the ideal time to look back, so please join me on this personal retrospective. Maybe you'll learn something new along the way. The year is 2015. I had just played and completed Undertale that October, and was toiling away in a seasonal job that left me tired, burnt out, and unappreciated. At the time, my primary fan work was a Kingdom Hearts AU series called Antipode, but I had been working on it for close to a decade on and off, and was feeling rather fatigued. I had noticed the Undertale AU scene in passing, and I had an interest in Royal Swap and Canon Divergence AUs. However, the leading swap AU at the time, Underswap, really wasn't my thing. The art was fantastic, of course, but I was never a fan of AUs that swapped the personalities when changing the roles, as I felt there were more interesting narrative opportunities if you explored how Character A would act in Character B's role, and what consequences that would bring. I think my biggest disappointment at the time came from the perspective of an Undyne and Papyrus fan. To me, there were huge missed opportunities by not keeping Undyne's loud, bombastic, and justice-driven personality in the scientist role, especially when she herself was determined. I thought, hey, wouldn't it be fun if Undyne was a mad scientist with a mecha, with Papyrus as her lab partner? Wouldn't it be interesting if Mettaton was still the robot celebrity, leading to a more combative relationship with Undyne where the two drove each other crazy? My goal wasn't to remake Underswap, though some would accuse Inverted Fate of being an Underswap copycat at the time. I'm sure some people still feel that way today, but it is what it is. My goal instead was to create something distinct from Underswap that would be fun for me as a creator, and perhaps appeal to those craving something a bit truer to the characters' original personalities. Papyrus and Undyne were the starting point. The other characters took more time to figure out. How would Toriel as the active monarch work when she was opposed to a war with humanity? How would Sans work as the boss in Snowdin? Asgore wasn't too tricky to figure out, at least. The idea of him being a kindly caretaker who filled the ruins with flowers and actively mingled with the monster seemed like a natural extension of his character. Eventually, I came up with the idea that Sans was a member of the Royal Guard, acting as a sort of partner in crime to Alphys in order to reflect their implied friendship in history and canon. Alphys herself would be a far more reluctant leader of the Guard, less driven to hunt humans, and instead having joined out of a desire to be a cool, heroic protector like in one of her Japanese anime. Toriel... It took some time to figure out the rest, but I thought I'd play with her withdrawn nature in the ruins, being distant from the kingdom in contrast to canon Asgore. Asgore would remain the underground Santa, sneaking out to deliver gifts, and Napstablook and Chiron would remain in touch with Mettaton because Undyne would refuse to let him abandon his loved ones. Toriel's design was initially closer to canon, in that she still had her purple dress, albeit with a blue cape, crown, and a staff reminiscent of an echo flower. Blue to contrast Asgore's red. It wasn't until later that I further refined the design by giving her messy fur, a skinnier build, and a black tattered dress and gauntlets. These design elements were meant to evoke her sadness and mourning, her lack of self-care, and the echo flower-themed staff represented how her past still haunts her, like a distant echo. The gauntlets would symbolize her hands no longer being clean, as while she did not kill all 6 humans, 2 still died in battle against her despite her best efforts to prevent casualties. So I had the basic ideas of the roles down. I even made some rough concept art, with some early installment weirdness, such as Papyrus not yet having his goggles, and Alphys not yet having her crossbow. I'm not sure why her early concepts had her with spears still. I think the idea was that they could compensate for her short stature and work as a somewhat ranged weapon, but a part of me had considered a crossbow from very early on, and it was my friend Chaos Fantasy who finally convinced me to go through with it. I think I may have just been intimidated about drawing one. The oldest MTT appearance was just Mettaton Neo on some blueprints. This is another case of beta weirdness, as I eventually wanted to make a more unique design to pair with his box form. Speaking of his box form, it was my late friend Riley's idea to give him Kamina glasses. If it weren't for him, I would have been extremely stumped on Mettaton's design, so he's left a lasting mark on my work. Sans I had waffled on design approaches, torn between a battle body type getup or more traditional Royal Guard armor, until I decided to incorporate both, with his battle body being a padded t-shirt that Papyrus gave him so they could have matching costumes for a costume party, with Papyrus still wearing his original battle body clothes under his lab coat. This would also help to showcase a transition in tone between the lighter atmosphere of Snowdin and Sans taking his duties more seriously starting in Waterfall. Other designs would come later, with some requiring more consideration than others. My decision to give Frisk new outfits with each arc came from a passing thought that Asgore would want Frisk to dress warmly for the cold, and their attire change in Waterfall resulted from them effectively being a fugitive and needing a disguise. Hotland was hot, so they shed the borrowed hoodie and face mask from Sans in favor of a t-shirt and shorts. A lot of more minor character designs were mostly silly references due to Alphys' love of anime influencing her role as guard leader. This led to many mini-bosses and smaller encounters having visual homages to anime and video game characters, from Dogami and Doggeressa dressing as state alchemists due to being literal dogs of the military, to a majority of the enemies and NPCs in Waterfall referencing Square Enix characters. And Bratty and Caddy cosplayed as Ruby and Yang from Ruby because I thought it'd be cute. In hindsight, I do wish I had made the references a bit less on the nose, but it does make for some fun Easter eggs for readers. As for Mad Dummy and eventually Mad Mew Mew, I leaned into the Dio Brando iconography for her dummy form, which ended up only intensifying her transcoding when I incorporated Mad Mew Mew into the story. Her Mad Mew Mew design wasn't really based on any specific character, so much as evoking a similar sort of design aesthetic as Undyne's other robots, as the Mad Dummy and Mad Mew Mew remained very close to her, still acting as a training dummy, just with better gear. As for Asriel, I used a lot of the unused design elements from the Undertale art book as a basis, because I thought it'd be neat. I can't say much about other forms in his boss battle due to spoilers, however. In the early days, a lot of the music for Inverted Fate was basic. I basically just did song in the style of the role the character swaps to, with the exception of Undyne's music, which was more like a core-style rendition of Spear of Justice, which funnily was meant to be the Determinator's battle theme before I had an actual tone down for that scene. I was less experienced and less confident with myself, which led to a lot of leitmotif swap tracks, even for area themes, with some tracks that instead referenced other games and media I like, with Pokemon Mystery Dungeon tracks still being something I enjoy referencing even today. I didn't really start tapping into more ambitious and original compositions until I got to tracks like Stars Collide, Rise, Metaton, Spiral. As I went back and revamped older tracks, I got more experimental and stepped outside that comfort zone and the expectations of Swap AU soundtracks, putting more care into musical storytelling with the use of leitmotifs rather than trying to make one-to-one analogs to how Undertale used them. The Ruins track gained a more upbeat vibe with percussion inspired by Temporal Tower from Pokemon Mystery Dungeon, and Asgore's leitmotifs and Flowey's used instead of Alphys to reflect Asgore's role as caretaker and Flowey's influence in the story. Alphys' theme, Wavering Spirit, borrowed more Japanese-style instrumentation as well as bringing forth some synths from her original track. It incorporated a back and forth between Toriel and Sans leitmotifs, and a bit of Undyne's leitmotif to represent the inner conflict in Alphys' heart. Other battle tracks, such as Lazy Bones and Fallen Crown, would utilize similar compositional techniques to enhance the mood. As I honed my composition skills, I began to use more instrumental associations in shifting the mood of tracks rather than being beholden to Undertale's stylistic choices. So Snowdin Town got a jazzy swing arrangement with some instrumentation from its rating somewhere else. Fate of the Fallen replaced Undertale, borrowing some compositional flourishes from the unused version of Undertale, as well as bringing in leitmotifs and instruments relevant to Frisk, Papyrus, and Kara to reflect the sequence being less the story of Undertale as told by the monsters, and more about how they and Flowey parse the royal family's tragedy, Flowey's own history, and the hopeful future ahead. Along the way, other composers contributed to the OST, such as Lucas Pukas, Jamangar, Xenagirop, Pine with Sun, Fee, Dashing Toady, Thomas the Pencil, Jimmy the Bassist, and many others. However, as I became more comfortable with composing and mixing, I started doing more and more tracks, whereas early on, I was more reliant on the contributions of others. That's by no means to downplay the wonderful musicians who lent their skills to the project, and still continue to this day. Rather, it shows my own evolution as a composer. Tracks like Say Your Prayers Punk, Muse Rift, Fate of the Fallen, and Muse Monster stand out as pieces I'm especially proud of. As for Flowey, Frisk, and Kara, well, the decision to make it a sort of New Game Plus AU came from a desire to do something different. Asriel's desire to reset the world in his final boss gave me the idea of, but what if things went wrong? From there, I went with a partially amnesiac Frisk who only had deja vu, while a narrator Kara recalled everything and found themselves torn on how to proceed. Giving Frisk and Kara more defined roles naturally meant representing them musically. So, what leitmotifs would I use? At the time, Kara didn't really have a fully accepted leitmotif. Some people used Megalo Strikeback or Megalovania, but neither really jived with me. A less accepted fringe motif was Once Upon a Time, and I took that along with the unused Undertale motif and used those for their themes. While for Frisk, I went with Reunited and a part of Stronger Monsters. Reunited because it contains a unique motif that only appears at the end of the pacifist route, and Stronger Monsters because it only appears in hard mode, which requires the Frisk file name. So by late 2015, I had a lot of the rough concepts down. I'd even started sketching up comic pages, but as is rather obvious by now, Inverted Fate would not remain a fully drawn comic. When I worked on the initial prologue comic sketches, as well as an early comic sketch involving Sans and Papyrus, I didn't quite realize the sheer effort that a fully drawn comic required. As I began inking and coloring the prologue comic, however, that all changed. I was undiagnosed for ADHD at the time, and this lacked the medication to keep me focused. And so, with the sheer time it took to digitize my comic pages, I found myself frustrated with the process. It made me question if I could really commit to a project of this scale, and my motivation wavered. I could have done a prose-based fic instead. It was my comfort zone after writing Kingdom Hearts fics for over a decade. But with the fandom so dominated by art and comics, I wasn't sure if it would catch on, and many of my ideas were so visually oriented. So what could I do? The answer came in December 2015, when I discovered Story Shift. For those who don't know, Story Shift began as a sprite comic. Its earliest iteration was fairly simple, but it stood out for its creative swaps, generally solid characterization, and authentic Undertale aesthetic. Not long after Story Shift, several other sprite comic AUs would follow, including the likes of Undertoad, Helptale, and a number of swap AUs lost to the sands of time. I saw potential in this format. It had been a long time since I had made pixel art, but I used to make sprites all the time when I was younger. The Undertale style was a bit outside my wheelhouse, but it'd be interesting to try. That being said, there were elements of these sprite comics that bothered me. Namely, a lot of them stuck a little too close to Undertale structure. Often the training dummy, the long hallway in the ruins, and other such elements were largely unchanged. Mini-bosses were skipped, leading to a faster pace, but also missed opportunities. When I planned the early segments of IF, I wanted to challenge myself to do more. Since the dynamic between Frisk and Papyrus had grown so pivotal to the AU at this point, I wanted to make Frisk a more fleshed-out character. I wanted Flava to pretend to be an ally, so he could take advantage of Frisk's saving and loading. I also wanted to play around with the maps and mini-bosses, so I went into a lot of pre-production, though my early work was a bit crude. Frisk's talk sprites looked too much like potatoes with hair. Asgore's overworld sprites were wide, though eventually Nora would help refine them in the remasters. Initially, I did sprite edits for most characters instead of doing fully custom artwork because I was intimidated and wary of straying too far from the Undertale style. Eventually, I dropped that mindset. After the ruins, I moved more towards custom sprites for dialogue and battles, though Sans and Frisk retained fairly crusty talk and battle sprites until later. The early overworld sprites for Sans and Papyrus were also more awkwardly edited. But not wanting to abandon the comic-style format entirely, I'd sprinkle in some drawn pages every few chapters. By the end of Snowden, I switched to cutscene-style panels instead for more consistency. Frisk got their updated talk sprites at the end of Snowden, as did Sans, with Sans' battle sprites getting updated in Waterfall, along with his, Papyrus, and Frisk's overworld sprites. Nora actually helped with the base of Sans' head for his updated sprites. And I believe that Eclair helped with the armor body, but it's been a while. Early on, all the map edits were done through stitching together in-game screenshots to create maps, with me painstakingly creating custom objects and editing those maps. By the time I got to Snowden, there were already assembled maps to work with, which made it easier to avoid accidental mixeling when positioning new objects, but it still required some heavy work in certain cases. For instance, I basically redid all the puzzles in Snowden, and while the Spike Maze puzzle was as easy as slapping tiles over the empty space where the electric maze was in the original game, other rooms required more heavy alterations, such as a new EXO puzzle that was designed by Nora, or the floating platform puzzle that replaced the large ice puzzle. New puzzles required not only new assets in certain cases, but also careful design. This was also a factor in the ruins, where I replaced the Spike Bridge with a Bridge Seed puzzle to reflect Asgore's disdain for spikes as revealed in the phone calls. And then there was Snowden Town, which not only had the ambitious Hollow Sky added to reflect Undyne's desire to make monsters' dreams come true, but also added objects such as teleporters, a more futuristic shed for Papyrus to reflect his mad scientist antics, as well as some new objects and revamps to the Skeleton House. By this time, I had additional help from artists such as Forz and Metatoriador to help polish my initial sprite objects, and in general, IF was becoming more of a collaborative effort with both art and music. The first real collaborative effort came from the Sand State, where Forz assisted with the dating UI as well as backgrounds, while I made the character sprites. Forz would then go on to contribute a lot of custom tile work for Fort Aquarius and Waterfall, which was Inverted Fate's first fully custom area, and marked a transition in its production and scope. By 2017, a lot of the Undertale sprite comic community had learned of the program Tiled, which made it significantly easier to build custom maps for sprite comics. Forz was a pioneer in custom tile sets, who offered a ton of guidance in making Undertale-style tilesets, and eventually I would create my first real tilesets for the town of Forge Spring and Waterfall, in addition to using Forza's Fort Aquarius tilesets to build some of the rooms, while he tackled others. That was around the time Inverted Fate's production really found its stride. Basically, when it came to making Inverted Fate's sprite comic chapters, I had gradually built up some templates in Photoshop. Using reference screenshots, I would position text boxes, menus, and dialogue portraits, with folders for each individual menu, text box, and even individual character portraits to make editing faster. Photoshop lets you re-edit text layers, so I could simply have dialogue templates at the ready. With layer sets, I could position all of a given character's sprites as individual layers within a single folder, and then move that folder when I needed to move a character and toggle which layer I wanted for a given pose or expression. And since Photoshop preserved map data outside the canvas, I could simply move larger map layers around for things like panning. Battles were a bit more complicated, as I needed various bullet boxes for attacks, different word bubbles, as well as the bullets themselves. Similar principles applied though, with layer sets for characters, bullet boxes, menus, and even the buttons of the UI. Papyrus got its own template, so I'd toggle between Frisk turns and Papyrus turns in their own PSD files. Shops also got their own template, along with other custom visuals such as the codec calls and Fort Aquarius. By the end of Waterfall, I had built up a library of templates that greatly streamlined the production of the comic chapters, with myself and other artists building tilesets in advance to show more custom visuals. Not only that, but this was our chance to really expand the scope of Inverted Fate's world and further distinguish it from other swap AUs. Fort Aquarius even existing in Waterfall showed a stark contrast to the area in Undertale, where Undyne alone was imposing enough. It also tied directly into a lore tease earlier in the story about the Waterfall incident. Little by little, this arc dropped breadcrumbs about its history, from Toriel trying to undermine Asgore's declaration of war against humanity, to a violent human's rampage forcing her hand as she, Gerson, and a gifted mage ultimately brought an end to the tragedy. The establishment of the fort marked a change in how the Royal Guard handled human threats, by establishing a stronghold beyond Snowdin, designated as a safe zone for humans, and keeping the rest of the underground safe. Additionally, Waterfall expanded to include a town called Forge Spring, to show how under Toriel's rule, there were greater efforts made to expand existing territories and offer safe refuge in the shadow of the fort. These segments required a great deal of work between tilesets, mapping, and custom NPCs, as well as more original music, but they were a joy to create. NPC contributors included Pine with Sun, who would later go on to design the Season Dudes in Hotland, Nora, who created the scheming shopkeeper Spout the Spider, and Force, who designed Moss of the Shopkeeper and wrote all of his and Doge's dialogue. Doge was a character based on the cut Doge character from Undertale, albeit with characterization inspired by Force's earlier works in the Undermyths sprite comic. Her inclusion was partially to give another unique perspective and expand the Royal Guard, but also as a sort of tribute to Force helping with the tile set. Other cut characters, such as Royal Guards 3 and 4, would also appear. From Fort Aquarius onward, Inverted Fate also incorporated more animated GIFs. Mildred was one of our biggest contributors at the time, creating really intense and iconic GIFs, such as Papyrus falling dramatically through his own dialogue box, or Alphys' dramatic moment leading up to her fight. I eventually made my own GIFs, and animator Electric Sparks contributed some great GIFs in the core, as well as helping with the production of the Determinator battle and Primetime Turnabout. Hotland and the core further leaned into custom artwork, with the laboratory being completely redesigned in a hugely collaborative effort with artists such as Lilica, Cyan, Pine with Sun, FMS Draws, and Metatoriador. It allowed us to create a cool, unique aesthetic where the lab mixed hot and cold elements, with water tubing spread throughout to keep things cool and moist for Undyne, while Papyrus' half of the lab leaned into warm colors. It was a treat personalizing the lab's interior to fit the two silly scientists, their personalities, and hobbies. Highlights included Papyrus' coolness ray, Undyne's collection of absurd video game-based weapons, and a literal waterbed, and a signed MTT poster just for Papyrus. Lilica also contributed the background graphics for the Midnight Metaton Hotland segment, which leaned into a parody of Sailor Moon, where MTT acted as the uniformed heroine, while Undyne reluctantly played a pastiche of Tuxedo Mask. In fact, all of MTT shows ended up parodying Japanese media or tropes, with a fighting tournament as the stage of the second segment. The entire segment allowed for silly shenanigans, such as bringing in more obscure characters such as Glide and So Sorry, though the latter would be replaced in the most recent playable version of the chapter with a Temian cosplay, designed by Pearl. To go into why would be a whole can of worms that isn't suited for this video, but if you really want to know, look up Floriverse and Samael to get more information. Then there's the core, which was expanded into a full-length RPG dungeon with brand new puzzles and branching paths into areas based on the ruins, Snowdin, Waterfall, and Hotland, with more difficult versions of previous challenges. Taking inspiration from the Mega Man series, each of these areas ended with a Robot Master-style boss, who together formed the aforementioned Season Dudes. In addition to Pine with Sun coming up with the enemy designs of smaller robot encounters, Electric Sparks contributed many tile sets and animated GIFs. This area also gave the Mad Dummy/Mad Mew Mew an elevated role, which built off of previous encounters throughout Hotland, where Frisk had unintentionally offended the spirit possessing the Mad Dummy. This added a lot more shenanigans in the core, as rather than hiring mercenaries, Undyne was more than ready to handle the situation with robots of her own creation, and the Mad Ghost spirit simply possessed many of those robots. In the end, this led to a much livelier core between Mad Mew Mew, Mettaton, and Undyne's involvement, and the tipping point of the Undyne confrontation especially led to some great work later on. Either way, the scope of the project had grown, and even before IF began integrating higher production value GIFs and tile sets, I had always envisioned the next Mettaton segment as something more. It was that ambition that would eventually lead into IF's progression into video and playable segments. Before we delve too deeply into Inverted Fate's transition into multimedia, there are a few other aspects I think worth discussion. As mentioned, Frisk in Inverted Fate is not a silent protagonist, but a character with their own voice, personality, goals, and history. For a sprite comic project, this was probably a risky choice, as it abandoned the familiarity of Undertale's presentation in favor of making Frisk more of an active participant in character interactions, and by doing so, I had to build a personality and a character out of what many deemed a blank slate. This ran the risk of alienating readers who didn't agree with my interpretation of the character. For one, there were many different Frisk interpretations. Some liked them as literally mute and using sign language to communicate. Many liked Frisk being entirely warm, kind, and sweet, though there were others who liked their asshole Frisks. Character age was also divisive, with interpretations ranging from small children to tweens. When it came to creating If Frisk, I knew that I wanted to go with an older, tween-aged kid, as it would be easier for me to write, but also because I felt that it was a nice transitionary life stage between child and teenager. In terms of their voice, it kinda just developed the more I wrote them. Early on, If Frisk seemed like a nice, silly, and sassy kid, based on some of the dialogue options and how often they could flirt in battle. But as I developed my ideas for them, I decided that this was at least partially a mask for them. I asked, what kind of kid would go up a mountain famed for its disappearances? It could be someone bold, it could be someone adventurous, or it could be someone who wanted to make a statement. I was a fan of the orphan or runaway interpretations of Frisk, so I had this thought that they came up to Mount Ebot so that people would notice they were missing and come after them. This would later expand to them having a childhood friend they wanted to rope into their scheme, but friction between them led to Frisk accidentally harming the one person they cared for, making them wary of fighting despite having a scrappy streak in the past. This would then tie into their interactions with the Ruins bullies, whose rude demeanors reminded them of the worst parts of themselves and the worst parts of the people they'd try to impress in their desperation to be seen. Their tendencies to be kind and act in ways that would make monsters accept mercy was a reflection of them tailoring their behavior to be as likable as possible, and their trust in Flowey and early attachment to Asgore both stemmed from a deep insecurity and loneliness. By making Frisk more of a character, it also meant exploring how death, saving, and loading would affect them, which in turn allowed me to build on their dynamic with Flowey, who used his own familiarity with the ability to load to build even more trust. This worked well to contrast with Papyrus, whose bright, sincere enthusiasm provided Frisk with a healthier connection, all while allowing Flowey to manipulate them both. This trio basically became the core of If's narrative, with Kara existing in the background at first, merely narrating and occasionally interjecting when their wariness for Flowey really set in. Characterizing Kara also proved an interesting conundrum due to the divisiveness of the fandom. They are a character who is often viewed in extremes, often as a purely malevolent force or misunderstood victim. I want to strike a balance between acknowledging their fault in manipulating Azrael for their selfish revenge scheme, while also still being a kid who undoubtedly suffered great turmoil before the Underground, and who, as Frisk's spiritual tag-along, had to face the consequences of their actions in the previous timeline. As a result of this, Kara in Inverted Fate had already experienced many challenges to their worldview by virtue of Frisk actually being a human who cared and didn't fit at all into their hateful view of mankind. But also, as Kara had seen up to the end of the Pacifist run, they knew from the start that Flowey was their brother, which is why they initially encouraged Frisk to speak to Flowey before later growing uneasy. Kara's presence became more pronounced as the story progressed, with them interacting with Frisk more from the end of Snowdin during the escape sequence, and them gradually talking more from Waterfall onward. This eventually culminated in them gaining their own dialogue portrait in the core, and them solidifying themselves as a core member of the cast. My approach to writing them tried to strike a balance between Undertale's snarky narration and the more aloof formal speech you see in Undertale's Mirror Run. Like Frisk, their characterization kind of evolved the more I wrote them. as did their bond with Frisk, and it's definitely become one of the highlights of working on this AU. Of course, just as the characterization evolved, so too did the comic itself. Although Inverted Fate started in comic format, animation was a part of its legacy very early on. A year or two into the production, Electric Sparks approached me with interest in animating the comic, and ended up animating the first few Ruins chapters. We dubbed these chapters, though at the time I was far less experienced in editing, and so the animations came across as a bit choppier than our initial gifts that he provided me. Still, Sparks did fantastic work and became a major contributor to the project from that point on. At the same time, I was working on graphics for an Ace Attorney-inspired segment in Hotland, which I had planned as far back as the Snowden arc. For a time, I was unsure how to handle Mettaton Stevie's segments in this story, especially with Mettaton set to be a more benevolent character toward Frisk and Papyrus. When I got the idea for Snowdrake, Chilldrake, and Icecap to go running to Hotland and blab about their encounter with Frisk. This, coupled with Frisk uncovering one of the security cameras, set the stage for the conflict with Undyne, but also for Mettaton to capitalize on the publicity with the televised court drama. I loved Ace Attorney, and I really loved the fan-animated series Turnabout Storm, which combined the adventures of Phoenix Wright with My Little Pony of all things, and was a really fun project to follow. It also showed the potential in doing a sprite animation styled after Ace Attorney. So I went in fully planning to make it a video segment, despite the challenges. The sprites were more detailed, and I needed help with background assets. My friend and contributing artist FMS Draws rose to the occasion, and talk of the Ace Attorney segment went as far back as the Snowden arc, leading to fan compositions by musicians such as Jimothy Stewart. At the time, I hadn't fully solidified the trial, but as work continued with the Waterfall arc and the introduction of Basier von Doge III, based on the cut Doge character, the pieces fell into place. This actually led to Inverted Fate's first major hiatus in 2017. As midway through producing the trial, I was approached by Minoshi, who was interested in making it a playable experience. This led me to write a more detailed script to account for gameplay choices, and we had our dubcast do a lot of voice work. Xenogurop, Pineless Sun, and Forz also helped by making the witness sprites for Snowdrake, Chilldrake, Icecap, the Snowman, and Doge, though I would make minor adjustments and additional expressions for some of these. Minoshi got partway into production for the game, but eventually things stalled and fizzled out, and I ended up going back to the initial plan to make it a video. The good news is that because of this hiatus, it allowed me to get a lot of work done in advance for later chapters, and allowed us to integrate Mad Mew Mew into the story, as work on the video version of the trial overlapped with the Switch release of Undertale in 2018. Not only that, during the hiatus, I was approached by Nisha Wolf, who enjoyed the comic and wished to create a more immersive experience via a website that would incorporate background music in time with the comic panels. The project became something truly awesome, with artists such as FMS Draws, Scraffs220, and others contributing borders for the comic that would change with each arc. The website would later expand to include other fun features such as the Gastos interface, which visitors could access the secret pages with, and additional side stories and lore. And later, the fully interactive Undyne OS in the True Lab arc, with a slick UI designed by Sufon, and cutscene videos illustrated by Super Curvy Lover and myself. Cap and Toad would also help with contributing slides for the Karen Asriel documentary Mettaton made in the Date chapter, making the Mettaton Date segment a greatly collaborative chapter. Of course, that all came a bit later, and at the time of Primetime Turnabout, the website mostly served as a fun way to experience the comic and OST together. I spent many long Twitch streams working on the trial videos as well, but the stream VODs are sadly lost media, unless someone ended up archiving them somewhere. Though some of the editing was a bit choppy, I was proud to have put it together, and Primetime Turnabout ended up being a feature-length production between its two parts. In 2025, it would also finally see its playable debut in the interactive chapter pack produced by Fee. I'll toss a link in the description. By this point in the production, though, we had already set our sights on the Undyne Mecha, or Determinator, battle being fully animated and voiced as well. Due to me working ahead, the chapters covering the end of Hotland and most of the core were already completed by the time Primetime Turnabout dropped, and the comic would leave off on a cliffhanger at the end of Mettaton Spiral's fight in 2018. Little did we realize at the time this would turn into a 2-year hiatus due to production troubles along the way. The Determinator hiatus is, to this day, the longest hiatus Inverted Fate has ever seen, though that's not to say we weren't working on the project. While I weighed the animation and the voice actors did their thing, I kept plugging away with scripts, visuals, and music for New Home and True Lab. I had even made some sprite comic versions of chapters 48 and 51, which covered the Everything Is Not Fine segment and Toriel battle. Ultimately, we decided to make the New Home segment a video so that we could time the visuals to the music. To do this, I worked together with Cake and Bokeh on an engine in Create Your Frisk, while providing sprite comic mockup panels in addition to the script. This basically meant making a playable version of New Home solely for the purposes of recording a video. Additionally, I was contacted by Fee about creating a playable version of the Mettaton Spiral fight in Scratch, and the two of us worked together to create something authentic to the comic. We would later do the same for Alphys, Asgore, Mad Mew Mew, and the Battle of the Ages segments for the story, which would ultimately lead to Fee helping to finish the Determinator animation after Electric Sparks lost a lot of the footage due to hard drive issues. By then, we learned of the cheap tester scratch fork, which allowed Fee to work at the 640x480 native resolution of Undertale, which not only allowed us to create more authentic visuals, but also revamp the previous Scratch games and create future projects in an improved resolution and engine. During the hiatus, I also worked on many cutscene slides and animations for the Determinator rematch, which I had initially planned to make as a video entirely on my own. But once Fee joined the team, we revamped the project to combine these cutscene graphics with gameplay segments and create a richer, more immersive experience. At this point, Fee was basically a mainstay on the Inverted Fate team, bringing to life many memorable moments and giving readers a chance to experience several in playable form. If had gone from a sprite comic to a fully multimedia experience, and this would carry on for the rest of its run. The end of the hiatus brought a huge burst of video chapters, one after the other, from the Determinator fight all the way to Toriel. Though it took a long time for If to come back, to this day I'm immensely proud of the work we achieved, and how we were able to elevate such a climactic part of the story through animation and interactivity. The sprite comic format would return after, albeit with occasional videos mixed in, such as the Mettaton concert and security tapes included in the aforementioned Undyne OS. In both these cases, Super Kirby Lover helped with polishing up some of the cutscene slides, making them art that I originally did, and they polished up. Electric Sparks would contribute some awesome animated GIFs for the Amalgamate encounters, as well as creating the idle animations for the memory heads, and helping with one of the pre-battle Mech Amalgamate GIFs. I also learned how to use animation tools in Aseprite to create pre-battle animations for the Amalgamates, which proved very challenging due to their mechanical designs. This segment would also include another playable battle, where the memory heads took control of Mettaton to try and send a message to Frisk and Papyrus by bombarding Mettaton with memories and imagery of the old timeline. The cool part about True Lab is that we included Alphys as a guest party member, which was also included in the playable downward spiral encounter, as well as the comic versions of the Amalgamate fights. Perhaps one of the funniest consequences of the Determinator hiatus, however, was the introduction of Spamton into the AU. Some people got the impression that we included him solely because of the hype behind the character, but the truth is we added him for a few reasons. First, we had a scrapped plotline where Spout the Spider would create a money-eating robot for his own grandiose schemes, trying to build his own wealth. Next, when planning the Undyne OS segment of the True Lab, I had the silly idea of, what if Papyrus befriended malware, and that malware was Spamton? Third, as we drew closer to the Null arc of the story, it occurred to me that it was very, very empty outside of Napstablook and the River Person, and our only real plan for Hotland was for Frisk's childhood friend Lilac to appear and for there to be a sort of robot uprising. Making Spamton an AI downloaded into a robot body, who also annoyed the hell out of Undyne and Mettaton while Papyrus viewed him as this weird middle-aged child, allowed us to connect these ideas and have a central figure to the robot uprising in Hotland, while providing some much-needed levity to offset the doom and gloom of the arc. Plus, it made for a fun parallel to the Weird Route, when Spamton took over Queen's Mansion. It was around the end of True Lab that Inverted Fate also shifted toward fully animated and playable segments, with Liz animating the Asgore and Napstablook anniversary segment, and Fee coming to work on the Sans interlude segment, which not only delved into my interpretation of his and Gaster's backstory in this universe, but also showcased Papyrus's time lab, which he used for a variety of time-related experiments and research, including an attempt at a time-traveling car. This chapter was also highly collaborative, as Super Kirby Lover and I worked together on the cutscene slides, and Sufon contributed the slick UI for Papyrus's temporal monitoring station. If I had stuck to doing Inverted Fate as a sprite comic, we never would have been able to accomplish so many cool visuals and memorable moments, weaving together pixel art, music, and storytelling in a way that I couldn't be happier with, and that spirit of collaboration still remains strongly in place. Look no further than the Victory Lap segment as another example. While Cake and I utilized the same base engine used in the initial New Homewalk, Kate coded all the idle animations for the encounters, while instructing me on how to use the engine so that I could position the NPCs and code in their interactions. It was a lot of work, and sometimes minor coding mishaps led to silly goofs like Parsnip crashing the game, but it was a really enjoyable opportunity to return to programming for the first time since high school, and it allowed us to put everything together at a much brisker pace than if I had left it all to Cake. Victory Lap in general was really enjoyable to assemble, not only as an opportunity to bring back many NPCs from earlier in the comic, but also to throw in little Easter eggs, like Alvin, Caddy, Jonkington, Bertley, Rudy, Susie, and Noelle cameos, while also giving teases at the wider Inverted Fate world that existed out of focus from the main story. Looking back, this really isn't unlike the Undertale 10th anniversary stream, with its own little sneak peeks at the wider underground. Truthfully, there was so much more I wanted to explore in If's world. For instance, I had initially planned on having a Metatown hub area around the MTT resort, which would have its own quirky NPCs and shenanigans as a breather before the core. This was scrapped primarily because of pacing concerns, but also due to the amount of extra work when there was already so much to do with the resort, the core, and the upcoming battle sequences. Similarly, Temmie Village never got a proper appearance in the comic, despite existing off-screen. My main allusions to the Temmies came from a brief encounter back in Snowdin during the Lesser and Greater dogfight, as well as an NPT fangirl Temmie, who was a recurring NPC. Another Temmie would later be added to the updated Battle of the Ages interactive chapter pack, to replace So Sorry, as I mentioned before. In any case, Victory Lap was designed to evoke the feeling of a false finale, complete with a seemingly cheerful tune that steadily detuned near the end, only to loop and return back to its bright, peppy mood. The goal was to evoke an uncertainty and a sense of dramatic irony, as while Frisk, Papyrus, and everyone else believed they were on the cusp of their happy ending, most readers and viewers knew that Flowey had other plans in store. The following chapter, The Angel's Promise, marked what would be the beginning of Undertale's final battle, but instead served as the start to a bold and ambitious arc that was entirely new. Like with Victory Lap, this chapter began with deceptively peppy music in the form of Season Finale, which was a swing-style piece of music that combined Mettaton's leitmotifs with the Victory Lap, Fallen Down, and Null leitmotifs, which would later become more front and center in the soundtrack. I took some inspiration from the Super Mario 64 credits theme for this, at least in terms of style and vibe. Rather than interrupt a rematch with the Monarch character, Frisk and Papyrus walked into the barrier room in the middle of an interview between Toriel and Mettaton, and shenanigans ensued, though Asgore soon appeared to offer his apologies, as did Undyne, and a sentimental moment followed after with everyone, including Kara thanks to some Mad Mew Mew split soul shenanigans. This was all a prelude to Flowey's big scheme. Rather than make this an entirely scripted cutscene, Fee and I chose to make this an interactive boss battle that essentially amounted to Flowey playing with his food. We thought this would evoke a delightfully unsettling atmosphere, especially when combined with the off-inspired musical track Checkmate. Originally, this track was a collab between Lolica and myself, but Fee eventually came in and gave it some finishing touches. But perhaps one of my favorite moments in this chapter comes right at the very end, when Flowey stops playing around and seizes his power fully and completely, and a blue screen of death kicks in over the credits. The idea came from Liz X51, who would step in as lead animator for the remaining chapters, and it served as a fun way to visualize the idea of a game crash like in the original Undertale, while allowing viewers and players to sit and stew on what they just saw, until a strangely dissonant music track kicks in, with an up-until-now unheard voice speaking over a black screen. Astute readers who engaged with both the comic and the secret pages likely knew who this was. Frisk's friend Lilac, who had been mentioned all the way back in Part 37, was finally getting a proper appearance, only for a brand new intro to come in swinging, with cutscene art created by me and a banger track by Fee to really tie things together and lead into this brand new arc. Null began rather bleak and empty, very much by design. At first, the only characters physically present were Frisk and Kara, and a glitched and grayscale version of the Underground. Asriel did leave haunting messages through echo flowers, physical objects, and the like, but the desolate atmosphere was very much inspired by the purified zones in Off, and this was an idea I'd had since the very, very early days of the comic. Likewise, the battle encounter with Kara was planned since early on, although the finer details of it changed as I solidified Kara's role in the story and had them fully come out to Frisk and the core. What I originally planned as outrage from the situation changed to being largely stressed and guilt-ridden response, with Kara trying to drive Frisk back due to being so overwhelmed, only for Frisk to comfort them in the end. And so the two journeyed together, physically and tangibly, as the only lifeline for each other in a haunting, twisted mockery of the Underground. Post-credit sequences would tease to Lilac's progress toward Mount Ebot, as well as things to come, such as the robot uprising and Spamton's grand appearance. Eventually, some hope and levity would return by way of NPCs such as the River Person and Nastablook. But for this leg of the story, I took a lot of inspiration from Undertale's murder route. Empty shops, eerie background music, no enemies in sight. The track Muse Null was deeply inspired by Off as well, designed to be more dissonant and atmospheric than melodic. That being said, the Null motif would be used in more melodic tracks going forward, such as Muse Hollow, and became one of the recurring leitmotifs of the arc, alongside the Hope motif, first introduced in Muse Pensive. In this arc, I actually animated the scene between Frisk, Lilac, and Kara at the start of Null Part 6 using After Effects, while Liz handled the rest in Photoshop. It was another opportunity to practice with a program I only had light experience in, while helping lighten the heavy workload at least a little. Honestly, the real highlight of Null was most certainly Null Part 7, The Surface, due to the amount of custom assets. This was a collaboration between Murky Sparks, Souptails, and myself, while Liz expertly added haunting effects through the animation process to further add to the uneasy and unstable state of the world that Asriel left behind. Heartless Mushroom had also helped with some of the animations in this arc, such as Frisk's breakdown animations, Frisk strangling the Echo Flower, and Starlight Sam also assisted with Kara's torch animations. Once again, the spirit of collaboration was strong. But the surface was really just an appetizer of things to come, as the upcoming Rift arc will truly raise the bar for IF's production. Inverted Fate's Rift arc marked a transition where Liz left Photoshop behind in favor of moving full-time to After Effects. This allowed them a much greater degree of creative freedom and functionality, allowing them to really go all out in how they presented the visuals going forward. In fact, Rift was the very reason Liz came forward as an animator for the final arc, as the initial tile sets inspired them. They really deserve their flowers for all the hours of work put into bringing these videos to life in such a stunning fashion. Not only that, but Rift allowed us to pay tribute to many other talented creators in the fandom by way of scattered monitors in the main hub, which showed images of other fanworks. We collected submissions privately among the Undertale AU scene for several months leading up to the production of these chapters, allowing some more unknown projects to stand alongside more popular giants like TS Underswap. While none of these had any bearing on the actual plot, and in hindsight some of the time dedicated to reacting to the monitors did hinder the pacing, it was a way to share the love of creation and the shared enthusiasm for creating Undertale AUs. Not only that, but each Rift segment had its own unique aesthetic and art style, from the stark black and whites of the main hub to the church-like Ego sub-area, and the sketchier Denial. A great number of artists contributed to these tile sets, including Super Kirby Lover, Souptails, myself, and Liz X51 even pitched in for the most recent area, Helplessness, creating a ton of varied tiles to truly capture Asriel's most vulnerable feelings. Additionally, each sub-area had its own boss, with their own abstract design and style. Liz created the sprites for the Entity of Emptiness and the Effigy of Ego, while I produced the sprites for Fatality, Denial, Helplessness, and Possessiveness. That being said, the original designs date back years before we actually reached the Rift arc, at which time the themes for the Possessiveness and Denial figments were swapped, and the earliest version of Possessiveness looked like a theater mask with floating hands, while Denial resembled a tangled-up vine stalk with a single weeping eye. What happened was, I realized the idea of a mask fit Denial far more, while grasping vines felt perfect for the concept of Possessiveness. So I took these swapped concepts and adjusted them to be more Asriel-like. Then, I used Clip Studio Paint, using different brushes to give them a distinct aesthetic before downscaling them to be more pixelated. In terms of other art contributions, I can't thank Schraft enough for creating the overworld sprites for Asriel, as well as assisting with some smaller overworld sprites for Child Asriel. Souptails assisted with Lilac's overworld sprites as well. Meanwhile, Liz took the Photoshop Flowey approach to both Ego and Emptiness, using found images to stitch together their forms. I really think the eclectic designs helped encapsulate how otherworldly this arc was, with the varying tilesets serving a similar purpose as well. As a fun fact, the Possessiveness area not only took inspiration from Ralse's castle in Deltarune, but also the Golden Land in Umineko with its elegant golden flowers. The main Rift hub drew from Castle Bleck in Super Paper Mario, as well as the World Machine in One-Shot. And Omori influence absolutely bled its way into aspects of both Possessiveness and Helplessness. That's not to say I deliberately stole from these other games, as I had these ideas for the areas years before I even touched Omori, but they really helped inspire the creative direction and deserve their flowers as a result too. The main track that served as the basis for all the area themes was Mia's Rift, which drew inspiration from a track called Silent Avalon by Ufalka, though it eventually took on its own identity, particularly with each iteration. With each sub-area, we'd compose a variant with musical style fitting the themes and vibes, from the more grandiose Mia's Ego to the heavily understated Mia's Helplessness. Fee contributed Rift variants in the Fatality area, as well as Mia's Brink in Null Part 7. At one point, I had considered having these Rift variants carry on into the Figment battles, but Fee strongly proposed having unique battle themes for each Figment, which I think was ultimately the better choice with how long each Rift chapter ended up being. Length is perhaps the most divisive aspect of this arc. Some people find the pacing too slow, and in hindsight I can certainly see why. Unfortunately, during the pre-production phase, pacing concerns didn't come up as much as we would have liked, and by the time we had moved on to animation, it was too late to make many adjustments. It's unfortunate, and part of why I've dragged my feet in writing the finale is due to regrets regarding the pacing and the feeling of letting people down. Inverted Fate is a project that a lot of people care about, and when delving into such an ambitious arc, it was always bound to be risky. That being said, I'm still immensely proud of what we have produced. There may be issues with pace, with repetitiveness in some aspects, but at the same time there are many moments where I look at it and look at what we made, and it just feels so cool. There's something to be said about how animation truly breathes life into concepts, and I'm deeply humbled and grateful for all the friends and teammates who have contributed to Inverted Fate over the years, and elevated it from a simple project into something so much greater. Truthfully, it's been around 2 years since I wrote anything new for Inverted Fate, at least on a larger scale. The scripts for Rift Parts 9 and 10 are more or less complete, and I have an outline for the final battle, but my own frustrations and feelings of discouragement have left me with cold feet. The mounting pressure of sticking the landing has also left me intimidated. But this is a story I fully intend to complete, and however flawed If might be, this is a project full of memories, milestones, and one that pushed me to grow as an artist, writer, composer, and a project lead. More importantly, it is not only my project, but the culmination of work of many talented people, be they artists, musicians, or programmers. It's my hope that this year I can finally confront all the uncertainty that's held me back and make If's 10th year a year of finally truly writing that conclusion. We're older now, and busier too, but one way or another, we will see this through. Though my motivation to work on Inverted Fate has been rather low for a while, it's still a project that means a great deal to me. It may be flawed, it may not have perfect pacing, but despite all the hiccups along the way, I'd like to think Inverted Fate is a truly unique fan creation that will hopefully stand the test of time. Sure, it's no Glitch Tale or Underverse in terms of popularity, but it's a project that I and my teammates made with love for Undertale, Deltarune, and fanworks in general. As for what the future holds, Fia is hard at work bringing more chapters into the interactive chapter pack. Maybe by the time this video is out, the updated versions of Fallen Crown and Downward Spiral are already out. If you'd like to check out the game, I'll link it in the description. We plan to bring everything over that's already been released on GameJolt and Scratch, then finally release Rift Part 9 and begin work on the Sands Battle in Snowdin and Final Battle. Not sure on the order yet. Eventually, I may go back and remaster some of the old chapters. Some still use old sprites, and I'd like to at least have the rest of Snowdin made more consistent, even if I can't add the improved side sprites that appear starting in New Home. If this video convinced you to read Inverted Fate, I hope you enjoy it. If you just came here from autoplay or other sources, I hope you enjoyed it too. This is my first video essay really digging into fanworks, but maybe I'll do more in the future if there's interest. Comment below and let me know what you think. Please do subscribe if you want to see what I do. And if you want to help support larger scale video essays like this, please consider pledging on my Patreon. I've got a lot more planned for 2026 now that life is settling down. Stay tuned for the Akechi analysis, probably this summer, as well as the meta-narratives video and more Deltarune videos. I gotta find the right balance, but it should be fun. Until next time, stay awesome.